Well, everyone, we have Rebecca coming in, so we are so excited to have her. I know that we kind of already did a quick intro to her, but Rebecca is the Senior Director of Programs at 0 and 3, and she is our speaker tonight talking about dual language development. She was so gracious to have joined us on our first webinar, and this was a topic that kept coming up. So she said she would carve out some time and talk to us a little bit more about it.
Great. Well, we are going to be talking about dual language learners today. And first, as Ali mentioned, I'm from 0 to 3. We're a national nonprofit. We focus on babies, toddlers, and their big people. I've included the link to our parenting resources if you're interested in learning and sharing more with the parents and grandparents that you know. So let's just start off with, languages. So, maybe some of you have traveled abroad and, just to kind of think when you encounter signs like this out in the world, what strategies do you use to try and figure out what these signs might mean? If you have ideas, feel free to jump in or pop it in the chat. But, you want to kind of follow the road signs. What cognitive strategies do you use if you don't speak the language?
Well, don't you normally would turn to somebody on the street?
Yeah, and say like, what is it? Yeah.
What is it? Or I'm pretty sure there are some language apps now where
Yes.
you can take a picture and it says,
True.
Translate it.
Whatever.
That's right. So, we have multiple strategies. We might kind of look at the pictures on the signs and be like, I wonder what that might mean. There's various approaches. And, what we find is that the same strategies that we use when we're visiting other countries are things that very young children are using as well, perhaps with the exception of apps, but we're not probably too far away from that. So I thought we could start off today with just kind of a fun true or false. So just to get a sense of, the number of multi-language learners and dual language learners. Increasingly, we are using the term multi-language learner because so many children are learning not just 2 languages, but even 3 or more. So 1 in 3 US children live in a household where a language other than English is spoken. Yes. True or false?
True.
Oh,
true. Yes.
Wow.
And then dual language learners, DLLs, just because it's a little bit easier to type, typically experience a delay in language development.
True.
Actually, that was that's my trick question. Yeah, that one's false. And we are going to talk a little bit about why that is, why we have that perception. So hang in, I'll cover that in an upcoming slide. Dual language learners comprise about 40% of children aged birth to 8 in Florida.
I would say that's true in Florida.
Yeah, it is true. And they've also experienced a 41% growth in dual language learning population since 2000. We know that being a dual language learner itself is not a risk factor for academic challenges, but poverty is a risk factor for academic challenges. And 58% of dual language learners in Florida live in low-income families. So that's kind of where the risk is sort of interacting with the dual language status. And then infants are unable to discriminate the sounds of more than 1 language. So basically, babies, all languages sound the same to them.
I don't think so.
No.
Right. Yep, that's correct. Babies are able to discriminate the sounds of different languages starting from birth. Wow. And actually, it's interesting, we lose that ability as we get older, and we basically become acculturated to the sounds of our own language, and we're not able to hear the differences of other languages. So, how do we define a dual language learner? Basically, it's a child or an adult, but in this case, a child who's acquiring 2 or more languages at the same time. And we can have a child who has a foundation in one language and then is learning a second language. So think about a refugee family who's coming with a 2.5-year-old. That child already speaks a home language and then will layer on English. We call them sequential dual language learners. And then a simultaneous dual language learner is a child who's kind of immersed and bathed in 2 languages from birth. So we know that dual language learners are a really diverse group. And I just gave an example of how. So the pathways to becoming a dual language learner are so different for every child. But we do know that more than 3/4 of dual language learners are born in the United States. And most are Spanish speakers, but over 1 million speak another language at home. And dual language learners' native language does impact their early language and literacy development. So for example, if a child speaks Spanish, there are many similarities because it has its roots in Latin. There are many similarities between Spanish and English. For a child who is, are exposed to Chinese, let's say, that might be a more difficult path for them because while we share some words with Chinese in the English language, it's not as many as Spanish. And then finally, I've been in this field for a while, and about 20 years ago, the guidance to parents of children with special needs was choose one language because basically your child already has some challenges. Let's not make language harder than it has to be. Now we use the exact opposite guidance. The guidance now is share the languages with your child that are the languages of your culture, because we know and we want children to build and sustain relationships, for example, with grandparents and extended family who may only speak the home language. So I'm going to speed through the boring research, but just to kind of give you a little bit of background on dual language development. So dual language learning children, when we talk about expressive skills, so the words they can say, they achieve the same language milestones as compared to children who only speak one language. They start babbling at the same time. They say their first word at about 1 year, about the same time. They combine 2 words like me up, baby up, and they achieve a 50-word vocabulary at about the same time as monolingual learners. We used to think that children who were dual language learners had a language delay. And the reason we thought that is because when we assessed their language skills, we used English assessments. So nowadays, what we recommend and the best practice is to assess children's speech in both English and their home language. Because what we have found is that the vocabulary of a dual language learner as a young child is split between 2 languages. And when you combine those, their total vocabulary is about the same as a monolingual child. But we need to capture all those words. So that's why we need to assess in both languages. And this is what I just said. And then children beginning very young start to develop translation equivalence. And that's basically the ability to name the same object or idea in both languages. So to be able to say cat and gato, and to know that those 2 things both mean little furry creature that, is in our house. And the number of translation equivalents in a child's vocabulary reflects their exposure. So the more exposure they have to both languages, the more translation equivalents they'll have. And generally, what we recommend to parents now is if they want to support their child in becoming truly bilingual, that they would have 50% plus or minus exposure in both languages. Now, I'll acknowledge that that gets very tricky once your child enters the school system because they're spending 6 to 7 hours of their day immersed in English. So that it's usually when children enter school that they begin to show a preference for using English because it's what they quickly become accustomed to and more proficient in. And then when we think about children's listening skills, we know that babies born to bilingual mothers prefer listening to both of those languages over others. So we know at about 20 weeks, babies can start to hear, granted 20 weeks of pregnancy. So granted, we suspect that it's pretty muffled in there, but they are still hearing the rhythm and cadence of their home language. We also know that listening skills emerge in lockstep with monolingual children, and they do show recognition of familiar words in their languages at between 10 to 13 months. So, you know, a lot of times there used to be this perception that, you know, we should drop the home language as soon as possible because we don't want to confuse children. But what we know now is that fluency in a home language gives children a strong foundation on which to build skills in a second or even third language. And so I thought I would briefly touch on some strategies to support dual language learners. So first, you know, in an ideal world, you know, would we be able to offer dual language classrooms? The truth is that the research shows that this kind of setting makes a big difference for children, that they actually show greater gains in both English and Spanish when they're in a dual language classroom. And I really relate to this because I minored in Japanese and I actually lived abroad in Japan. And I'll say that, you know, it makes a big difference to have a little bit of English to hang on to when you're immersed in a language that you're not yet fluent in. So I always kind of bring it back to my own experience as a student. We've also found that when we strategically use a student's home language, it can actually aid in English learning. So we might use it to label something. We might use home language to provide critical instructions. We might use home language to help build teacher-student relationships. So to really be using home language in a thoughtful and intentional way. Another instructional strategy is for the teacher to try and learn keywords and phrases in a child's home language. And in preschool or childcare, we can really partner with parents around that. We can also help children by pre-teaching keywords from a story that we're planning to read that day. Because if we're reading a story about a polar bear or a jack-o'-lantern and a child doesn't know what either of those things are, they are going to be very confused and not be able to make the most of that literacy experience. So pre-teaching can be very helpful. We also can use props in the classroom. So if I'm reading a Halloween story this month or in October, I can have, you know, a plastic jack-o'-lantern so a child can see and touch what I'm talking about. And then we can also bring in, you know, cultural informants and language models from our community to read stories, to share songs, to, you know, share in rhymes, so that children not only see their language represented, but we also offer monolingual children exposure to a wider world. We also want to try and engage children in conversation, right? Because the way that we build vocabulary when you're a toddler or a preschooler is not through lecture. It's by talking with someone and having those rich, responsive interactions. So taking turns in a conversation helps children master the language. But what we see in early childhood classrooms is that this can be a challenge for monolingual teachers, of course. So let's put our researcher hats on again. And let's make a prediction. So if we think about a conversational turn where I say something and then you say something, how many conversational turns do you think teachers share with each child every day in a toddler classroom? You know, like if a toddler points and says dog, the teacher might say, oh yes, look at that furry dog. He says bow wow.
Half a dozen?
Huh. That's a good guess, actually. So what this particular research study found was really interesting and a little concerning. What they found is that when children spoke the same home language as the teacher, you see all these amazing, rich conversational turns happening, between 18 and 28, back and forth interactions. When a child spoke a home language different than the teacher, we see for one child only 4 back and forth interactions, and for the other child, 8 back and forth interactions. And what this raises for us in the field is this concern that a dual language learner may become isolated. And as a result, they're not able to really leverage the rich language environment of their classrooms. And so this is where we see opportunities to provide support to preschool teachers in understanding how to connect with students who may not speak their language yet. Another instructional strategy that I think is so important is that sometimes we tend to learn the home language in order to manage behavior. But when a child has only spoken their home language in the classroom when they've done something wrong, this can kind of send like a not so nice message about your home language, right? So we don't want to rely on home language just for setting limits. We also need to remember, and I certainly experienced this in Japan, that children who are learning English take a lot longer to process what you're saying. I remember, asking for directions on the streets of Tokyo, and they would start off and I'd, be listening so carefully, but by the time I had heard and processed the 3rd word, they were already on the 20th word. So we need to kind of remember that toddlers and preschoolers will need a lot of repetition and they need a lot of processing time. So to slow it down. And then in terms of family partnerships, again, working to build that relationship about what a family's goals are for their child's home language. We also want to communicate to families that they don't have to stop speaking the home language. We want them to continue speaking the home language at home because bilingualism is such a valuable skill in our society today. And then, to always check ourselves that there's no one right language, that there are many pathways to language, and that bilingualism, again, is a strength. And then to encourage families to share songs and stories in their home language and perhaps even visit the classroom, as well as to visit the early childhood classroom to share their traditions and culture, because it's good for all children to understand that there's a wider world out there. Woo! So I think I actually managed to get us back on time. So I'm going to pause here. I'm sure that you may have some questions. I just wanted to highlight that if you do work in early childhood settings, there is an app developed by the federal government. It was developed for the Head Start system, but it's available to anyone. And it's an app that gives you key words and phrases from a wide variety of languages and also provides strategies for teachers on supporting dual language learners.
Rebecca, I have to tell you that my brain is just buzzing because we do pancakes and reading in the park, and we didn't do it this past year because of COVID, but the year before, the first time that we've ever done it, we go, we should have someone reading Spanish. So we have one book, one reading, but now I'm thinking, the Hebrew language, Haitian or French.
Right.
And
exactly.
I, as soon as we get off, I'm going to email the chair for that and really focus on that and explain that children from ages 1 to 3 can be very successful with dual language. And in fact, it's what Kiwanis is all about, is embracing all of the cultures and languages. And what you said, there's no one right language. We arrogant Americans. And I did have a question. I'm wondering if it's difficult to get the parents to embrace this new way of thinking, to use dual language in the classroom, because they do feel that English is the language everyone should use.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents themselves, have experienced roadblocks in their lives because they don't speak English. So they feel, they want their best for their kids, as all parents do. So they feel really passionately that they want their kids to become fluent in English. And I think, what we try to do is really encourage parents and reassure them, your child is going to learn English. There is no question about that. They're immersed in English through media. They'll be immersed in English in their early care and education settings and in their school settings. But that their home language is a way to really continue to connect with family and culture. At the same time, it's important to also honor parent wishes. And so to really sort of partner with them, meet them where they're at, share information about bilingualism, that being exposed to home language will not put their child behind, and reassure them that they are going to be exposed to strategies in the early childhood setting or in this activity where they will be able to master and practice both. We find that it helps children, for example, for the children who are, listening to the story, even like hand motions. So if you're reading a story about trains, to have everyone moving like a train or making the train movements, adding props or movements really helps children sort of connect the word with the meaning. And those are sort of little tips and tricks we use in the classroom.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Cher, one of the things though, as Cher said, that's an excellent idea. However, we do read to kids too in schools, but one of the problems we find is that you have to read the books they give you. You see, these day schools, I don't know where you are, but you can't introduce something that's not in their syllabus. You know what I'm saying? So it's a little difficult, but that's a great idea if we could.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how flexible they are, but even if you have to read the books they provide, you may be able to label key words in the story in a different language, because even monolingual children are so curious about different languages, right? They're like, oh my gosh, there's a different way to say cat. So if you're reading a story about cats, you can say, does anyone know that cat in Spanish, what cat in Spanish means? And if there's a child in the room who can answer that question, they just, they're like, whoa, I'm pretty amazing. I could answer that question. So, maybe there might be a rhyme and you could share in Spanish after a book that's related to the story. Like if you're reading a story about a farm, I believe I've forgotten the words because I learned it a long time ago, but there's a rhyme in Spanish about little chicks going pew, 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 something like that. Or do you know that rhyme? I can send it to Allie, actually. The 0 to 3 has a resource of rhymes to share with children in English and Spanish. So I can send that along if you'd like. But, I think there's, depending on the teacher's openness, there's ways to sort of, integrate it into an existing storybook.
Well, with Diana, here in South Florida, almost all early learning centers, child care centers are bilingual. They just are. Both my grandchildren, the ones they went to, their teachers were actually Cuban by birth, and they would do everything that you're talking about, so that I dropped something on the floor and my granddaughter would pick it up and go basura and go and throw it out into the garbage, because she knew the language. And of course my wife is Hispanic, so she would read books even in English and then say the cat is gato, and would do that. But once you get past the 0 to 3, you really need to get the principal of the school to buy into the bilingual, like by presenting some of this information, because they're worried about their supplies and who's got the bus duty and who's doing lunches this morning
and testing and all of those.
Right. And they might not be as astute as the people on this call who have the background in this. And so if you were to, when you meet with the principal before the year starts, to talk about reading programs and all that stuff, having it, having this information might be a very powerful weapon to get to. If they buy in, then their teachers are buying in, because that's what the principal wants. That's the way it's going to go.
And the research does bear out what you say, because there was a very interesting study that found that in families that didn't speak English at home, for older child, if they had an older and younger child, as soon as the older child went to school, the younger child got less exposure to the home language. Because what happened is the older child would go to school and begin speaking more English at home. And then the parent adapts to speaking more English at home because they want the child to talk to them and respond to them. And so as a result, older children tended to do better in the home language and younger children tended to do worse. So it was a very interesting study, just sort of about family systems and what a monolingual school system sort of does to language exposure. Because again, we want to have that ideally 50-50, 40-60 input in the languages in order to maintain bilingualism. Oh, go ahead.
That's what you were saying is a perfect example of my father and his 8 siblings. He was number 3, so he and his 2 older sisters entered school at the same time, not speaking English. They only spoke Portuguese. So my grandmother and grandfather said, "Oh, we can't do this to our kids." So if you go down from the 3 oldest to the 3 youngest, the 3 youngest never spoke Portuguese very much. So it's and the older grandkids spoke, of the first 3, spoke more Portuguese than the younger ones who spoke no Portuguese. So it's interesting.
It's very interesting, how the languages move through the generations and how the world has changed. I mean, my aunt, in New York City in the 30s, she entered kindergarten not able to speak English. She only spoke Armenian, and they sent her home. They said she has to come back until she can come back when she speaks English. And then when she started again, her name means mourning dove in Armenian, but you say it Ahavni, and it's hard to pronounce. Her teacher renamed her Agnes, and she went by Agnes the rest of her life. Yeah. So the world has changed, and we're so much richer as a nation for it. But I think we still have miles to go, and so starting young, but also looking for best practices from early childhood programs that we can pull into primary school is, I think, a good idea, because I'm pretty proud of the work we're doing in early childhood.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, and you definitely are making a huge difference. We did have one question that I want to make sure that I ask, so I don't forget, because this was emailed in. We have a lot of clubs that do early childhood book drives. Oh yeah. And especially in South Florida, we had a few people ask this during our webinar. Is it more important for them to give a home language-based book so their parents are actually reading to them, or is it better to have a second language book be brought?
I mean, first of all, I think any book that gets donated and given to a family is the right book, right? So, but I think in an ideal world, we would be giving parents a book that they feel confident reading with their child. And if it's not in their home language, then, what I might consider doing is just coming up with some tips about sharing this story with your child, in the family's home language. But, what we recommend are things like, don't worry about reading the words, just tell the story based on what you see on the page. Things like that, label objects that you see in the pictures, ask your child questions about what's happening in the pictures. All of those practices, those book sharing practices, can happen in any language and don't necessarily have to be directly aligned to the exact text, but it's really about getting parents and children talking and enjoying books and engage with books. And ultimately, I suspect that's the goal of sharing books with families through Kiwanis. So I would consider that.
That's a great suggestion. Well, thank you again for being with us. You did such a great job. We'll give you a hand of applause.
Thank you. And thank you for bearing with me, everyone, with all my technical difficulties. So it was wonderful to see you.
May I just say, Alex alerted me to this seminar, and I am just appalled that I haven't been in on more of these. And how do we get more of our clubs? This was it was a revelation for me. So how do we get more members of clubs to sit in on these Zoom meetings? This was just fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Take
Thank
care.
you. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This will be available online on our website and on social medias, and Cher will continue to send these out. We'll send out a monthly email and then an email just a few hours before, like Alex sent to you saying,
Yes.
we're only 3 hours out. So we'll continue with that. And thank you all and have a great night. We really are appreciative, Rebecca. Great
Thank you.
job.
Okay.
I'm
Bye,
sending
everyone.
emails right now. So
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye,
Adios
guys.
from Miami.